Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I saw a really interesting post from a Canadian who has, for most of his life, actually lived in the UK, talking about Brexit. And I think that, as we think about some trade wars and separation and political issues, thinking about how political decisions that may seem kind of fun at one point in time and have huge economic calamities later on is something that we got to give some consideration to. And so I wanted to reach out to Nick Tyrone. He's a British journalist. He's an author. He's a researcher. He's written several fiction and nonfiction books, and he runs a Substack called Neoliberal Centrist Dad, in which he writes about British politics. Nick, welcome to the show. Are you there?
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah. Hey, thank you.
So the UK left Europe, the EU, not Europe, but the EU, in 5 years ago with Brexit. Why do you still care about Brexit? Why are you writing about it today?
It's a great question. One of the things about it is lots to say about this. I think the first thing is what Brexit promised and then what it's delivered, and why that's relevant. So I think, if you like, there was four reasons I think that the Brexiters made why Brexit was a good idea during the 2016 referendum. One was it would cause the EU to collapse, and then what we'd see is a whole new trading sort of something would have to emerge on the continent of Europe. I think the second thing is that would feel to being in the single market, but without having to pay in or follow the same rules. I think the third was that there'd be this amazing US trade deal that would emerge, and then there would be a painless solution to and those turned out to be correct. And you sort of say, okay, well, none of them turned out to be correct, but we've left, and where are we, and what's the problem? I think one of the big things is Brexit itself is quite unstable. And what I mean by that is the situation in Northern Ireland, it continues to be and it's increasingly unstable. And I suppose one of the solutions to that might be just let Northern Ireland join the Republic of Ireland, but that in itself has vast issues connected to it. And then actually on trade, I mean, things that we've had is Britain hasn't acted on Brexit yet. And what I mean by that is we are essentially facing a situation in which the EU has slapped loads of trade barriers. So they're non-tariff barriers, but nonetheless, it's like everything has to be checked, and there's from the EU to Great Britain. But actually, they haven't been enforced yet. And one of the reasons they haven't been enforced yet is because it gets so much. So, I mean, food's the big one, but lots of other goods that come from continental Europe. And then if we were to apply, if you like, if we were to apply the same sort of level of checks that are getting into the EU, we'd probably have huge shortages, and we'd have huge problems, and we'd have a lot of issues. So, and then the problem with long-term not applying those same checks are quite severe. I mean, one of which is, in a couple of years' time, it's sort of going to seem obvious, like, well, what if you're going to set up a business in Europe? Why wouldn't you? And that was Britain focused. Why wouldn't you set up, say, Northern France, where you are in the single market and you have access to the single market? And actually, your barriers to entry in Britain are not that severe. So why set something up in Britain where there's all sorts of problems trading anywhere else, for exporting anywhere else in the world, whereas you could just be in the single market? So it's one of the reasons we care about it. And also, I think a big one, it was supposed to basically solve a huge problem in Britain, which was that of the rise of the populist right. So we were told that, if we were out, we wouldn't face the same problems that, say, France is facing with the rise of Le Pen. We wouldn't have that issue. And actually, it would completely neuter Nigel Farage, and he would go away, and that wouldn't be an issue any longer, basically, as soon as we voted to leave the EU. And obviously now we're following it itself, and we're almost 10, we're going to be looking at 10 years next year from the referendum, and Nigel Farage is bigger than ever. In fact, the point that is a genuine threat to the Conservative Party. Huge, massive. I mean, on the level of something you had in Canada with Reform, actually, and the fact that they're called Reform makes the parallel even easier to make. So basically, it didn't really solve any problems. It created a whole bunch of, and now we can't really. It's very difficult to talk about those problems because the debate around Brexit in Britain is quite childish, actually, and we can expand on that. But it's yeah, we basically we're in a place where we can't really talk about our problems, which is a big issue.
Can't really talk about your problems. Big issue. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with Nick Tyrone from the UK talking about Brexit 5 years post. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting with Nick Tyrone. He's a Canadian that has lived for most of his life in the UK, and he's got a Substack that is kind of interesting that he publishes on a fairly regular basis. He's actually a British journalist. He's an author. He's a researcher. He's written several fiction and nonfiction books, but his Substack is called Neoliberal Centrist Dad, and he writes about British politics. And I was fascinated that he wrote about Brexit 5 years later on. I got to ask you, I've seen some polls, both during your last election and then most recently, that say the vast majority, maybe not the vast majority, but the majority of people think now Brexit was a bad idea. But yet no party wants to challenge it and or redo it or undo it. How come?
Well, so unfolding that. So Labour, I understand. Labour went through a really bad thing with Brexit. It really sort of ripped them apart. I would argue that actually had less to do with Brexit than other things, but I think they think that Brexit was a major issue there. And they feel like, well, a lot of the northern seats, the seats in the north of England that they need to sort of keep hold of, that they've got back off the Tories at the last election. So basically, Labour are spooked. That's the main thing about Labour. I don't think that's sustainable with Labour because so much of their membership is pro-European. So I think that will probably they'll face a crisis on that at some point. The Conservative Party are just wedded to Brexit. I think I don't think that's a good idea for them, but that's really where they are and where they feel. Obviously, Farage and Reform are they're the Brexit party essentially. The strangest one really is the Liberal Democrats, who really came out as the sort of the strongest anti-Brexit party, but now they've gone really silent on it, and I find that really, really weird. So to some extent, it's a sort of it's the result of first past the post and the way that all the parties, rightly or wrongly, think their vote lies. But I can imagine at some point in the near future, particularly given, as you say, Brexit isn't popular any longer. I guess the problem really is how do you approach it? Like as soon as you say Brexit was a mistake, it opens up the question, well, what now? And do we need another referendum, etc.? Which that might not be popular. So that's the issue. It's not that Brexit's popular. It's just that reversing it or changing it, that might not be popular either. So
why? Because the referendum was very divisive?
Oh, very. It was a really bad time, I think, for lots of people in Britain. I think that particularly in the aftermath of it, it was very divisive. I think one of the things that really sticks in people's minds is 2019. It really hit. It reached a really bad point where we basically had a sort of constitutional crisis in Britain, whereby you had Theresa May's Tories who didn't actually have a majority in Parliament. They were a minority party that were relying on basically Northern Ireland Unionists to prop them up, and she came with this idea about how to leave the European Union that was popular with no one. It wasn't popular with the pro-Europeans who obviously didn't want to leave, and it was a fairly hard Brexit in lots of ways. So even the people who were pragmatists amongst the pro-Europeans were like, no, this is terrible. It obviously just wasn't hardcore enough for the really hardcore, passionate Brexiteers. So basically no one liked it. And everybody was trying to figure out a way around the impasse. And we had all these like indicative votes, and none of them got majorities. And it was just a complete mess. And I think people look back on that as like this period of total chaos that no one wants to repeat. So people are like, oh God, if we had to have another referendum, wouldn't that be awful? And all that sort of thing. And then even something like having something akin to the Norway deal, which is basically we're not actually full members of the EU any longer, but we're in the single market. I think that even that people would say you're going to need a referendum to ratify that. So it's really no one wants to reopen the no one wants to have another referendum. Basically, that's the problem.
My sense is that one of the big issues was sovereignty, that decisions were being made in Brussels that ended up having some impact on Britain that you didn't like, and people wanted to have their own decision making capability in the UK. Do you think you've actually gained more sovereignty from Brexit, or have you lost some sovereignty because you're no longer part of the EU?
Well, that's a great question. I think there are two ways I'd like to answer that. The first one being one of the interesting things is, and I'm very close to this because between 2017 and sort of early 2019, I actually worked with a body on uh, post-Brexit regulation. So now that we were out of the EU, what laws could we change? What could we do? What could we do to make Britain more efficient? And this is actually one of the things that really strengthened my pro-European feeling, because I was sort of amazed going through everything how there was very little that you could change in any sort of positive way that would have a genuinely positive impact. And this is a classic thing that comes up in interviews today with very pro-Brexit, voices. You say, look, you say Brexit, we haven't changed enough, we haven't changed the laws, but what are the laws that you want to change? What do you feel is still on the statute books from our time as a EU member that you think is just waiting to be changed, and no one can ever come up with anything? So I think the idea that we were sort of, there were all these laws that we hated, but no one can name them. So I think that remains an issue. But I think you're right in the sense that, well, we've probably lost a lot of sovereignty in terms of we don't have a voice in Europe any longer, and we still kind of have to follow EU rules. And what I mean by that is, I mean, we don't have to follow it by law, but by the nature of the free market, that's just what happens. People, large businesses say, look, whatever you guys think, but the fact of the matter is that we're just going to make things to an EU standard because it's just easier. And why are we going to make something specially for Britain when there's kind of no point? So the fact that we've just, been able to create all these, basically the free market just dictates that like EU rules will still be followed on the continent of Europe, essentially. And then I think the other thing to close with on this point is there's this big thing. I mean, I don't know if you've caught any of it, but the whole Trump thing about like we're going to take over Greenland and actually we want to annex Canada. Britain's sort of been caught up in that, and there's this whole conversation about, well, should Britain become a 51st state of America? And I mean, the interesting thing about that is the people who are saying, yes, Britain should join the United States of America, are the very same people who for years and years and years have been talking about, well, the whole reason for Brexit was sovereignty. And so it's, to me, very odd that the people who are saying we need to leave the European Union for sovereignty reasons are now saying, well, we should give up our sovereignty and become part of the United States of America. So
I didn't
yeah.
realize that there was an effort or a point of view in Britain that said that you should join the United States. Is that from the Reform Party?
No, actually, oddly, Reform are very muted on that. Actually, it's more just no one really. There's no major elected political figure that's saying it, but it's just you read about it all the time. All the sort of center-right newspapers are really now pushing it. Like the Daily Telegraph or the Daily Mail will have sort of almost daily articles about how, oh yeah, here are all the advantages of if Britain joined, became a state of America. So it is just interesting. I mean, it's very recent. This hasn't been going on for years. It's really just in the wake of Trump being reelected and, Trump basically talking about all the places he wants to make part of the United States. So it's very recent, but it will be interesting to watch if Farage and Reform pick up on it. I think they're scared of it because they realize there's probably downsides to it. And they probably, I think, rightly intuit that like there's a whole section of their potential electorate that would not like it, basically.
One of the other issues that I perceived was a big issue with Brexit was the free movement of labor. There was lots of comments about the Polish plumbers and things like this.
Hmm.
That there was animosity slash resistance to immigration, but it seems like immigration is still an issue today. But maybe it's not from Europe; it's from the Middle East or elsewhere. Tell me about how immigration has changed, both before Brexit, when you were part of the EU, to today after Brexit.
Sure. So going back a little bit, there was a huge wave of immigration from the EU, mostly from Eastern Europe, when there was in 2004, 10 countries joined the EU, which was the largest expansion ever of the European Union, all in one go. It was Poland, it was Czech Republic, it was the Baltic states, it was Slovakia. So there was it was mostly Eastern Europe that just suddenly joined the EU. And actually, it's not really talked about in Britain at all. But the fact is that the European Commission essentially gave every existing member state 7 years to implement freedom of movement. So between 2004 and 2011, you could kind of do anything you wanted in terms of, you could say day one, everybody can just come in and it's just go for it. Or you could wait until 2011. You could wait till May 2011 before you let anybody in. And very strangely, most of the EU countries decided, I think, wisely to phase that in. What happened was Britain, Ireland, and Sweden all decided day one they would open things up. Now, Sweden got some immigration, but actually was never going to get a huge amount because Sweden, well, I mean, I don't want to expand greatly on Sweden, but it's just a much more closed society. And Ireland, its economy has grown massively since then, but at the time, it was probably, I mean, it was a much smaller economy than Britain's. So Britain was really like, it was the one country in the EU with a very sort of, if you like, classically liberal economy, very open economy, where suddenly everyone from Eastern Europe, everybody from Eastern Europe could just come. So it wasn't even like, well, Germany is going to, absorb some of this, or France going to absorb some of this, because actually they still had closed borders to those countries. So we got like 1 million people sort of came in, and it hadn't been talked about beforehand. The Labour government hadn't discussed this is something we're going to do. So it was a real shock to people. And there were places in Britain, like particularly I'm thinking about places like Lincolnshire, which is actually quite a poor part of England, but has a lot of like fruit picking and all that sort of thing, and certain industries that drew people from Eastern Europe. And suddenly you had these towns where the sort of the ethnic racial makeup of it hadn't really changed for like 1,000 years. I mean, and I'm not exaggerating, genuinely 1,000 years. And suddenly, half the town was Polish or whatever. So there was a huge culture shock for parts of Britain. And so that really, I think, was a big factor in why Leave won the EU referendum in 2016, because people felt like, well, this was just forced on them. And if anybody sort of said, well, this is a bit odd, what's going on here? It was just immediately like, they're racists. No one can talk about this. How dare you even bring this up? So there really wasn't a discussion around it. And I think that was really harmful. But I think the ironic thing is after we left the European Union in 2020, post-COVID at least, as soon as we were out of COVID, immigration skyrocketed. Because essentially what happened is we put in place a points-based system, a bit like what Australia has. And the right had loved this in Britain for ages. Oh, if we leave the EU, we can have this points-based Australian system. And, saying things are Australian in Britain can generally be like a positive. People go, oh, well, Australian, almost as if like if we have an Australian system, suddenly it's going to be sunnier in Britain or something. I think that's the psychological effect. But actually what people, again, wasn't really discussed is a points-based system isn't actually a way to cut down on immigration. It's a way to have a certain type of immigration that maybe you want to have, but actually you tend to have more immigration. And that's exactly what's happened in Britain. Also, because of the Ukrainian war, there's loads of Ukrainians who have come in. There was a whole crisis in Hong Kong, and people felt like because of the historical relationship with Hong Kong, we needed to let loads of Hong Kong dissidents in. There was the Afghanistan issue, and there were loads of Afghans who had worked for the British military, so we let them in. So all this came to a head, and we've had, I think like net migration in 2024 is going to turn out to be like 1 million or something, again, in a country of 70 odd million. So actually one of the great ironies of Brexit is immigration hasn't decreased, it's vastly increased. So how that plays out will be interesting to see in the years to come.
My sense, and maybe I'm just reading the wrong press, but is that there's a fair amount of opposition toward immigration today. Comments about gangs, about real negative race, what I would call racist comments about Middle
Yeah.
Eastern youth that are maybe it's Elon Musk, but raping females, etc. Like, what's going on? Is it racism? Is it real? What is the reality?
Well, I think racism just generally is on the uptick in Britain, in slightly a scary way. And the problem is it's coming from everywhere because, like, so for instance, there's been a huge uptick in anti-Semitism from the left in Britain, as a result of the situation in Israel-Palestine. But that's got very scary. So racism kind of everywhere is kind of growing in a way that's quite scary. I mean, in terms of the grooming gangs, I mean, the strange thing about Musk's comment is he sort of is you'd get the sense from his comments that like this was something that has been happening for ages and it's never been addressed in Britain and like this has just been shoved under the carpet. Actually, it's been discussed for ages and ages. Now, I think there's an argument one can say that it was never dealt with particularly in a particularly satisfying way. And it certainly seems true that there was some sort of racist element in that. And what I mean by that is actually that this was allowed to go on because there was some sort of sensitivity around some of the perpetrators in some of these towns, like Rotherham, like Telford, being of South Asian origin. So I think that's definitely true. But there's been loads of arrests, there's been loads of trials. There was a whole, there actually already was an inquiry about this. What happened was the Conservative government actually didn't really put a lot of the results into effect, partly because of cost, because it would have cost a lot of money. So that's another I think that just hasn't got a lot of press. But yeah, I think there is a reaction, I think, racism's on the uptick, I think, because actually this is a huge wave of non-white immigration that has happened. And again, it hasn't really been talked about. And I think one of the harmful things was the last Conservative government talked a big game about immigration, like about how immigration has to come down. And we have all these immigrants and it's really terrible. And it really talked heavily anti-immigration. But at the same time was the government that was presiding over a massive increase in immigration. So that's really harmful. And I think that's a big factor in why Farage is doing so well. Because, people are looking at the Tories going, well, you said that this was going to come down. You talked a big game about this and then it didn't come down. So who can we trust on this other than Nigel Farage? So overall, it's quite a negative situation. And as I was saying at the beginning, with something about happened with Brexit, where we just weren't able to talk about this. We can't talk about these things anymore in a kind of productive way, sadly.
One of the concerns about Brexit was that a lot of London, the financial industry, would move to Frankfurt or
Yeah.
Europe. Has that happened?
Not in the way that I think some of the most hardcore Remainers said. But yeah, some of it has, and it's not a big bang, so it hasn't happened. It didn't sort of happen overnight, so that the pro-Europeans could say, look, the city's just lost 100,000 jobs. It's more like a slow leaking away, and it's been less towards Paris and Frankfurt, and actually more towards New York, really. Um, you know, so it's more like air out of the balloon than the balloon being popped. But
Right.
but I mean the financial district, it has suffered because of Brexit. There's no question. And it's I think the problem for pro-Europeans is it's a bit like the boiling frog thing. It's like there's no moment where you can say, look at this. It's just a sort of gradual the city of London just gradually losing economic clout throughout the world, really, international clout. So that's unfortunate.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with Nick Tyrone coming to us from the UK, talking about Brexit 5 years hence, whether it was a good idea, bad idea, and what the lessons learned are. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're joined tonight by Nick Tyrone. He is a British journalist, author, and researcher. He runs a Substack called Neoliberal Centrist Dad, which he writes about British politics. He's a Canadian, at least grew up in Canada, but then has lived in the UK. For how long? How long have you lived in the UK?
27 years.
So you didn't spend much time in Canada.
Well, yeah. I mean, we moved around a bit, and I did spend like a formative chunk of my life in Calgary. But yeah, no, I came over here, and I actually lived in Manchester for a little while. And actually a really cool time to live in Manchester, I have to say. I was really look back on it as quite a formative period of my life because it was the 90s when I lived in Manchester. So it was Manchester, it was Oasis, it was, all of that. And then I moved to London. I've lived in London, oh God, almost 25 years now. So I've lived in London for a very long time. But yeah, yeah.
I spent a week in Manchester this summer, and it is a very economically prosperous city, and the downtown is alive, lots of
Mhm.
industry. I was really quite impressed by it.
It's incredible how much has changed since the 90s. I mean, I loved it. I had a great time in the 90s, but it was kind of a dump. Like it was really quite gritty and how I think people sort of view, if you think Northern England, it was a bit like industrial and a bit like, but they really just overhauled the city and the city was just able to really particularly in the 2000s, really take advantage of like, sort of economic boom there was in Britain. And, this the center of the city is unrecognizable to where it was in the 80s and 90s. I mean, just completely, which I mean, in a good way. So that's great.
So I want you to take a big step back, if I could. You write this Substack on neoliberal centrist dad, and I presume neoliberal. Actually, I'd love you to sort of define what neoliberal is, but my sense is neoliberal would be a believer in the benefits of globalization, free trade, etc.
Mhm.
Obviously, the United States, or at least Donald Trump, the incoming president of the United States, is um, is very nationalistic,
Mhm.
mercantilistic, thinking about dramatic increase in tariff barriers, and protectionism, and is against globalization and free trade. Doesn't believe in the theory of comparative advantage, and keeps on taking a look at Canada as one example, and the trade deficit that he runs with Canada, and saying it's bad, even though he doesn't think about how he's buying all of our oil and natural gas and actually improving upon it
Yep.
and then selling it at a profit elsewhere. So he doesn't think about sort of the
Mhm.
supply chain of things. He's only thinking about things from a one-off transaction between Canada and the United States. Um, and there appears to be a real sense of maybe not Brexit, but a very nationalistic attitude, and certainly not wanting to be in a situation in a free trade agreement with Canada where they've given up even small amounts of sovereignty to a free trade agreement that they've got complete rights to make all their decisions. Given your experience in the UK with Brexit, where the
Mhm.
right, and far larger than just the right, a majority of the country voted for a similar kind of separation from the EU, where's it coming from? And is it a right decision or a wrong decision? And will Americans live to regret it?
Well, so uh, on Brexit in Britain briefly, and then I'll move on to US Canada. So the interesting thing was how it was sold, Brexit. So it was the Leave campaign was particularly brilliant, and it was able to appeal to people who wanted a more isolationist Britain, who wanted to basically the people who stop the world, I want to get off, who wanted to who the idea of a Brexit will be some ability to turn Britain back to how it was in some, and you can land wherever that golden age is in your brain. It could have been 1970, it could have been 1815. Like it didn't really matter. It was just a sort of a nostalgia and a general isolationism. But at the same time, they ran this whole campaign called Global Britain. So it was this idea that actually it would allow Britain to be much more neoliberal. Like in other words, we were sort of like slightly we were hedging our bets by being in the EU, and we were taking a safe route and sort of, oh well, EU's right there, but actually these are all these moribund economies that aren't going anywhere. actually, if we're out of the EU, we could like have this free trade deal with the US, or we could try and agitate to make the Five Eyes some sort of trading arrangement. So Five Eyes being the military arrangement between US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and UK. And actually, we could have this Anglosphere trading arrangement. So that was always if you like, one of the problems with Brexit in practice was it was sort of promised to be both make Britain much more isolated, but also make it much more global.
But wasn't it sort of make UK great again? It was sort of
Yeah.
going back to the empire, which is
Well, yeah,
sort of
but
back to what Trump is arguing, the Gilded Age, when the US was expanding by either purchasing the Louisiana Purchase or by expanding through imperialism, effectively around the world. Let's take over Greenland, Panama, and Canada.
true, but Trump can make that. I mean, the United States is the most militarily and economically powerful country on earth. Britain, I mean, even the most nationalist Britain would not argue that that is the case for Britain any longer. So actually, quite what that, in terms of, you had to be a bit more clever in terms of trying to argue the return of the British Empire and what that really meant, because that had emotional resonance. But saying, well, we're going to leave the EU and annex Greenland, let's say, just to make things easy. I mean, that wouldn't have been believable, I think, for anybody. So there hangs this sort of question around, well, what does it mean? And thus why you have these kind of conversations around Britain becoming a state of America. It's like, I feel like there's this huge rub against across the West now around, in one sense, you have this argument for isolationism, but then you have this sort of other argument like, well, we need growth and we need to get bigger and we need to, in essence, like Trump's argument is sort of has a huge paradox in the middle of it, which is, oh, well, we need to be more isolationist and America's great and we have everything we need. Why do we need to trade with the rest of the world? Let's just throw tariffs on everything and, as you say, make America great again. But then that sort of rubs against this idea of like, well, let's annex Greenland and let's make Canada part of the US, or, like, well, by definition, you're sort of, you're that's sort of globalist. I don't know how else to put it, but it just is. So I think that's an issue at the heart of all Western center right politics. Is it about, do you want to go back into the past? Like, for instance, in Britain, great example. Do you want to just like have way less immigration, and sort of try and make Britain much more, try and somehow make Britain what it was 50 years ago or whatever that means. But then the consequence of that is we'd have less economic growth. We'd probably have lower living standards, etc. But is that worth it to have this, whatever, this more cohesive, conservative, I guess, from a certain perspective, society? Or do you want growth? And actually, frankly, in Britain, if we're going to have growth, one of the reasons we've had so much immigration is it's kind of the one way to sort of keep growth. And it's not like the growth is particularly impressive, but like just to at least keep it going, to not actually end up in decline. So, and I think one of the problems is there's a pretense that almost like they're the same thing, when actually there's a huge paradox there, that I don't think anyone's really addressing, which to some extent I'm trying to do with the Substack.
What is a neoliberal centrist position?
I think a neoliberal centrist position would be the following. You certainly, it's understandable when, having a million more people every year in Britain is not sustainable. It's just not sustainable. Even if you wanted to make some sort of argument about how it will create growth. If you want to live in a democracy, it's just not going to work. You're going to have the same problem. The problem we had with Leave winning the EU referendum, because we had a million people from Eastern Europe show up and no one could talk about it. So yeah, you need to have some sort of immigration level that's sustainable politically. But we also still need to attract the best and the brightest, and actually, we need to grow. And actually, we need to either, I think, frankly, either need to re-enter the European single market, which I would advocate for, or we need to be like, are we going to make some sort of deal with the US? Is that what's going to happen? And I think we need to do one or the other, basically, in the end, because We need to grow. We need to have an open economy because that's the only way that we're going to maintain, never mind improve living standards in Britain. So that's roughly what I would say off the top of my head.
5 years after Donald Trump last renegotiated the Canadian, Mexican, U.S. free trade agreement, he's now demanding major changes to it. And he was the
Mm.
author of the last free trade agreement.
Yep.
Can you trust negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States? And given what Trump is doing now, even if you had a free trade agreement, go back to your question, your comment about businesses locating in northern France. Wouldn't they still locate in the United States to get access to the UK? Because if you locate in Britain, things could change in 5 years when it comes up for renewal.
Precisely. I think this is actually a really good lesson for Canada, I think. And one that I think, a classic example of, I mean, one of the problems we've had in Britain is Brits have had a pretty good time of it, really, over the last 30 years. And geopolitically speaking, and I don't think they really understand how most of the rest of the world works. I think like being able to have freedom of movement in Europe has just made them think that that's the norm. And that's just how the world works. And actually, we didn't really need to be in the EU and have this bureaucracy and pay this money into the, Brussels to have these things. A classic one I had with like quite intelligent, otherwise intelligent people would say, well, like with we were trying to figure out a solution to the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Just to give you some idea, on the land border between Northern Ireland, which is a border between the UK and the Republic of Ireland, it's about 500 kilometers long. And trying to police that, how are we going to do that? What were we going to do to police that? And everybody said, well, you don't really need to worry about this. This isn't a big deal. Like, for instance, there's no infrastructure at the US Canadian border. And you sort of go, okay, that's someone who's never been to the US Canadian border who would say there's no infrastructure there. So there was a huge naivety in Britain about just how borders work around the world, how easy it is to work certain places if you, for instance, don't have a right to work there. Um, and I think with Canada, in terms of doing a deal with the US, yeah, be very careful because actually this is a thing for Britain. I think there was this idea of like, well, it'd be really easy to make some free trade deal with the US. When actually, if you look at the history of US free trade deals, they're very, very slanted towards the US. And you're seeing it, you brought it up yourself, Trump didn't think NAFTA was slanted enough towards the US, even though actually it was quite remarkably slanted towards the US, I would argue. And then he created this new deal, which now he says isn't enough, and it's sort of never enough, never enough, never enough. And I think this is going to be a problem for Canada in terms of how it's going to deal with. And it's a problem for the world. How is it going to deal with a US that's suddenly going, well, actually, we really care about us, and we don't really care about what's going on in Europe. We don't really care about what's going on in Canada. And actually, we just sort of want to close ourselves off to the world. What does that mean for the West? And I don't think there's enough of a serious conversation going on about that, actually.
What do you think is going to happen? What's your prediction in regards to Brexit and
Mhm.
in regards to sort of nationalistic fervor in the United States right now?
If I was going to make a prediction, I would say I would just try and apply Occam's razor and say probably Trump's going to say a whole bunch of stuff about annexing this, about doing this, about, getting Greenland off Denmark. And I think probably very little is going to happen. And the reason I think that in terms of actual practical terms, because I think, if you look back at his first presidency, there was a lot of noise and bluster, and actually not a lot really happened. I think Trump likes to talk a lot. And then in actual fact, the practicalities of things, he gets bored and then he moves on because, trying to get great, just forget about the whole, what he's talking about with, annexing Canada or Canada becomes part of the US or whatever. I mean, how complicated and how many insane issues are there to be dealt with. I mean, Greenland's way less complicated. And even that, I struggle to see it happening because, you have to be in like loads of discussions with Greenland, with Denmark, and I just think in the end, probably not much is going to happen. But in and of itself, that's an issue because what happens in Ukraine? What happens with Putin? Does Putin decide that he's going to try and invade the Baltics, for instance? He decides to, I don't know, invade Lithuania and see what happens. I don't think so, but I wouldn't discount it either. So I'm slightly worried about what's going to happen to the West, either in the scenario where nothing much happens with Trump, but then that's actually 4 years of just drift. And I'm worried about Russia and China and, enemies of the West just trying to take advantage of that. And the fact that that's probably the best case scenario. In fact, actually, Trump could decide to be very proactive, and I could be wrong about him just drifting. And what happens to NATO? What happens to just the cohesion of the West? I'm genuinely worried about it, but I'm trying to be optimistic and say I don't think anything particularly bad will happen. But watch this space.
We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Chatting about Brexit 5 years hence, but also the implications or what we've learned from Brexit in regards to where we are in the world today. Stay with us, everyone. Back for some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've been chatting with Nick Tyrone from the UK, who runs a Substack, talk about a neoliberal centrist dad. He's an author. He's a journalist. He's formerly from Canada, but for the last 30 plus years, he's lived and worked in the United Kingdom. So he brings to this discussion a really interesting perspective. And he wrote just a little while ago a really interesting article that I read about Brexit 5 years hence and what the learnings were. Nick, you just said that you thought that not much would happen. And I'd like to challenge you for a second, because I think that a lot of people, in fact, a lot of the people that I dealt with either as friends or business associates in the UK, thought that the whole Brexit referendum was a good conversation, potentially, but people would never vote for Brexit and it would never happen. And so therefore they were surprised and shocked when it actually, the referendum won to leave the EU and then it was actually implemented, because most of the people, I guess, that I'm associated with are in business in London. And so therefore we're probably part of the people that voted to remain. But they never thought it would happen. And they were shocked when the country voted that way, and then shocked when it was actually implemented. And it was almost as if they were convinced it was sort of the way that you talked about it, bluster, but wouldn't actually happen. So I really worry about Donald Trump. And you're right that he blusters, but I think that major tariff barriers are going to be put in place. And he, has talked about for a long period of time how tariff barriers and tariff receipts were the way that the United States didn't have any income tax at one point in time in the Gilded Age back before the turn of the last century, not this century. And it's true. The U.S. didn't have income tax at the time. It funded its government via tariffs. And I think he's going to put in tariffs. It may not be the 25% against Canada and Mexico that he's currently been talking about, but it could easily be 15% or 20%. And that's going to devastate the Canadian economy. He's demanded that we go to 2% of GDP in defense spending, which is the NATO commitment, which frankly we probably should have done long ago. But to do it, right away will devastate our governmental finance situation without other adjustments. And to do that at the same time as we end up having a tariff war, and the Canadian dollar ends up probably declining even more than it's currently declined, which is extensive. And this attitude toward immigration, we could have, you talk about 1 million people going into the UK at 70 million people. We had 1 million people come into Canada with 40 million people last year. And I think a lot of people are really worried that a lot of the people that are potentially going to be deported in the United States are going to, before he puts in place deportation orders, are going to escape to Canada. So we could actually have a huge migration issue coming into Canada. So I'm very worried that, sort of like Brexit, we're going to have a world that is far more mercantilistic, nationalistic, separated in the next 2 years than we've had in the past. And Canada is going to be a big loser in that regard unless we take strong action against that. And it may be to diversify dramatically away from our exposure to the United States. Tell me why I'm wrong.
Well, I don't know that you are, actually. I mean, like when I say I don't think Trump will do a lot, what I mean is I don't think he'll follow through on some of his more extreme ideas, like as in Canada will become part of the US. Green, he'll have this. There'll be this huge American empire. However, he probably only has to do some of the more minor and probably straightforward things within his agenda to actually have a massive negative impact. So you were completely right about the tariffs are terrifying. And actually, I mean, even if he puts them in at the lower end of what he's talking about, that would have a huge devastating effect. I mean, particularly on Canada, because you're right there, and the amount of trade you're doing with the US is huge. But it would have a huge effect on Western Europe, and actually all of Europe now, really. It would have an effect on the UK. I mean, and also the UK is in such a precarious place economically anyway. We're looking at growth figures that are minuscule. I mean, we've got an outgoing conservative government that's crowing about the fact that, well, under us, we were having, 0.3% growth in a year. And I mean, that's terrible. It's pathetic. But that gives you some idea about how precarious it is. And so if you're suddenly talking about something that's going to take, 1% off growth, now we're in permanent recession in Britain. That's a total disaster. So it's not that I think Trump won't have an effect. It's in terms of, I don't think he has to do that much for it to have an absolutely devastating effect on the West, and in particular Canada, because I mean, as you say, I mean, even if Canada pivots, what does that look like? Where does it pivot to? And again, realistically with Brexit, one of the lessons of Brexit is geography to some extent is destiny. It's very hard to escape. So this idea that, some of the fantasy of Brexit is well, we can do anything we want and we can be anyone you want. And it's well, yes and no. I mean, no, we're still 22 miles off the coast of France. Whether you like it or not, Britain is in Europe, is geographically located in Europe, and suddenly weakening all of our trade relations with every single neighbor is, I mean, the idea that that's not going to have a negative effect is quite naive. Same with Canada. Can it pivot away from the US? I mean, it might have to, but that will be really hard if that happens.
It will be very hard. And as you say, even if he does a little bit, it'll be really devastating. Nick, this has been really fascinating. Let's connect up again. I really appreciate you bringing your perspective to our listeners. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from London, England, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.